Okay, so welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the 8th one in the series about getting started in Humanistic Psychology. This video will also be the last one in that series, and after this video, we're going to start looking at your first official book in this class, which will be Carl Rogers' On Becoming a Person, a very famous book within the humanistic psychological tradition. At any rate, in the previous video in this series, we spent a fair amount of time tracing out humanistic psychology's historical emergence, which was localized more or less in the 1950s and 1960s. I tried to center it in the 1960s so you could understand it as a product of the cultural ferment that was occurring at that time, most obviously in the form of the hippie movement and the civil rights movement and agitation against the Vietnam War and that sort of thing in the United States. Humanistic psychology, of course, originated in the United States, so it's one of ours. Okay, so, and we ended off with this emphasis on being and this desire to explore human beings, the primary topic matter of psychology, in terms of the being that constitutes the condition of human being. Okay, so, and that prefigures a kind of intersection between this nascent humanistic psychology movement and various movements that were occurring in Europe at the time, and more specifically various movements within philosophy that had been occurring in Europe, and more specifically in the continent of Europe, okay, for, some of them for many hundreds of years, but the more relevant ones had been occurring for roughly not quite a century, a century I would say, about a century before the advent of humanistic psychology. Okay, so what are these movements? Well, the first and most obvious one, given that humanistic psychology seeks to inquire into the fundamental nature of being and integrate that into the purview of psychological inquiry, would be ontology. Little dramatic pause there. Okay, so ontology is the traditional philosophical study of being. It's been around within the canon of Western philosophy for as long as the canon of Western philosophy has been in existence, which is to say roughly 2,500 years. In other words, since the days of pre-Socratic antiquity. Okay, so that's sort of the large lay of the land, as it were. So European philosophy has long been interested in the question of being, and of course that made for a very fertile intersection between humanistic psychology and Western philosophy. But the more specific and more important intersection has to do with the two schools of philosophical thought that appear in your notes next. And the first one is a word we've encountered before in this class: phenomenology. Okay, now remember what I said about that word, that we're going to have several different usages for this word. Okay, so the first usage, let's sort of recap that because maybe it would be helpful for you. The first way we use that word, phenomenology, is to describe in a very loose and approximate way the general activity of reflecting upon everyday experience in order to get some kind of articulation of its underlying meaning or significance. Okay, so a very loose and approximate use of that word to describe that very general activity. The second way we used that word was in a more specific and technical sense, which is to discriminate the phenomenal layer of meaning, which is the layer of meaning that is inherent to our everyday existence before we reflect upon it, in contrast to the phenomenological layer of meaning, which is meaning at the level of articulation and thematic awareness that you can talk about and write about and think internally about, and so on and so forth. So that was the second, somewhat more technical use of that word. Now we're going to have a third use of this word, and it's going to have to do with this very specific movement within continental philosophy. Okay, now when I ask you about stuff related to this on the test, I'm going to make it really clear which one of those I'm referring to. Okay, so you're not going to have to guess too much unless you don't know your stuff, in which case you'll have to guess. But if you know your stuff, I'm going to make it obvious which one of those three meanings I'm referring to when I use that term. Okay, so little sidebar moment, all right? So let's look at philosophical phenomenology, the third way we're using that term. So like I say in your notes, it's the study of how things appear to our consciousness, okay, to our awareness, how perceptions, let's say, appear to our awareness, but it doesn't have to be perceptions as such, like how thoughts appear to your consciousness, how dreams potentially appear to your consciousness, how hallucinations potentially appear to your consciousness. But probably the easiest example is perceptual consciousness. So maybe just to help you get on board with what this is, let's just sort of talk about perceptual consciousness. So how things appear to our perceptual consciousness and how ultimately the world appears to us in terms of how we actually experience it. All right, so that would be a sort of more technical way of glossing this term phenomenology. So how is it that the world appears to you to be the world in terms of your perceptual consciousness and acts of your perceptual consciousness and appearances to your perceptual consciousness? Okay, once again, it doesn't have to be perceptual consciousness, but we're just using that as the easiest example to help you get on board. And then the movement known as existentialism, and there again, it's sort of a long, somewhat fancy word, but you know, I don't think it's that tough, because the word existentialism kind of has the word existence already embedded in it. Okay, so existentialism is going to be a philosophy that focuses on existence and revealing the meaning or structure of existence. So a movement in philosophy with corresponding movements within art, literature, and the larger culture. So in a way, existentialism is not merely a mode of philosophy. It sort of extends its tendrils out into other domains that make it, I think, much more interesting than just sort of a cut and dry mode of philosophy. So a movement in philosophy, art, literature, and culture that focuses on the meaning of existence, we've already said that, which is viewed in terms of being in the world. Okay, so you've already encountered this idea before in this class. So this mutually unfolding reciprocal relationship between what we are and what the world is, which is seen in a monistic, unitary way, using some of your previous vocabulary, just reminding you of it, hopefully. Okay, so that's going to be the focus of existentialism, and hopefully by now you can see, wow, there's going to be sort of a really obvious intersection between this existentialism stuff and the project of humanistic psychology as we've previously outlined it, especially when we were doing that compare and contrast operation between natural science modes of psychology and humanistic psychology. Might want to go back and review that video if you don't understand what I'm saying right now. Okay, so the holistic interplay of self and world. And I'm thinking you do understand that by now, or at least partially, let's put it that way. Now here's the deal. The next piece to the puzzle is going to be probably one of the more difficult moments in this class for students to get a grip on. I'm definitely going to emphasize it on the test, and I would say if there's any mass of material that you know particularly well for the next test, it would be what we've said before this point in this video, and also the stuff we're about to say in this video. So know that stuff real well. Okay, so in your notes you can see a diagram, a Venn diagram, flashing you back possibly to elementary school when you learned about Venn diagrams, that illustrates the interrelationship between phenomenology and existentialism. I'm slowing down because maybe you're not quite so familiar with these terms, so I'm using them a little bit more slowly so you don't feel like you're getting dragged to death in the middle of the lecture. Okay, so the Venn diagram has two circles kind of going like this, right? So they overlap with each other, right? So one of those circles, the one on the left in your notes, represents phenomenology. The one on the right represents existentialism. And you'll notice that they overlap. Okay, so implication here. There are going to be parts of phenomenology that are not, properly speaking, existential. There are going to be parts of existentialism that are not, properly speaking, phenomenological, and there's going to be a middle area, sort of shaped like that, where they intersect. So it's going to be both phenomenology and existentialism that's going on. But let's go through the Venn diagram and make note of the terms a little bit. At first, we're just going to sort of roughly outline what's going on, and then we'll get into what the terms mean. Okay, so for now, don't be too worried about the terms we're going to use. Just sort of get a sense for the general organization and where the names fit in. That's the goal right now. Okay, so the Venn diagram, focus on the Venn diagram. So that leftmost part of the Venn diagram, which is going to be about phenomenology that is not yet, properly speaking, a form of existentialism, is called pure phenomenology, sometimes known as transcendental phenomenology. Okay, so pure phenomenology or transcendental phenomenology. And the great progenitor of that movement is a man whose name is Edmund Husserl. Okay, so Edmund Husserl, the great thinker in the mode of pure phenomenology, and I wrote in the Venn diagram, he's the founder of the entire movement. He lived in the late 19th and into the early 20th century, if you're sort of wondering about the chronology there. Okay, so that was, 100, 120 years, something like that. Okay, so that's a while back. That's pure phenomenology. Now, what pure phenomenology does, we'll describe in a second. But like I said a second ago, since you were paying attention, you already know this. We're just going to outline it at first and then get into what the terms mean. Okay, so that middle area of the Venn diagram has to do with existential phenomenology. Well, that's sort of a slam dunk. It automatically tells you that there's going to be phenomenology going on and existentialism going on. It's where they intersect. It's where they're both happening simultaneously. And I wrote some names under there, too, to help you sort of sort out when you hear these names within the department, and you'll hear them with some frequency, you'll know more or less where they're situated. So Maurice Merleau-Ponty, okay, hyphenated last name. Right, so Merleau-Ponty, Martin Heidegger, whose name we've brought up several times prior to now. So he's the guy that talks about Dasein and being in the world and all of that kind of stuff. So you've heard this guy's name before. And then Jean-Paul Sartre, French famous existential thinker in the phenomenological tradition, especially in his most famous work, which is a big, thick tome, about 800 pages, called Being in Nothingness. Okay, by the way, maybe I should mention a couple things about the names. When I ask you about the names on the test, I'm just going to refer to the last name. So don't bother memorizing their first names if that's too much work for you. Okay, so sometimes students, you won't believe how often this happens. Like they'll sort of key off on the guy's first name, and so when I ask them about it on the test and I use only the last name, they don't know who the hell I'm talking about if I don't use the first name. That's not a good strategic way of studying. Okay, so memorize the last names first and foremost, and if you have a little extra time, then memorize the first names, but the last names are the ones you need to know. Okay. The other thing I should maybe mention at this point is that the way these names fall out, sometimes, like Sartre, you may know, wrote novels and plays and things like that. So he was doing something more than existential phenomenology. So, situating him within the camp of existential phenomenology, you can argue that, well, really he belongs in possibly some other camp other than that. What I'm doing here is situating them in terms of what they're most famously known for. Okay, all right. Heidegger wrote poetry a little bit, not a lot, but he did write some poetry. But at any rate, this is where they're most famous for knowing. Okay, now the rightmost part of this Venn diagram is what I'm calling literary existentialism, and this is, well, let's note the names first. So some of the names you may have heard: Soren Kierkegaard, Danish, very theistic Christian thinker; Friedrich Nietzsche, German; Albert Camus, Algerian French. Algeria, that's a country in northwestern Africa. Martin Buber, okay, so Judaic thinker who wrote in German. Franz Kafka, Czechoslovakian back in the day, I guess Czech Republic now. So at any rate, that situates some of the names. So let's get into what these terms mean, which is going to be probably the toughest part of this video. Okay, so pure phenomenology. All right, so let me start out by reading a little bit of what I wrote for you about pure phenomenology. And this is a very collapsed version, okay? But you don't need to know huge numbers of details about pure phenomenology for this class, okay? So pure phenomenology tries to account for the everyday appearance of the world how the world appears to you to be the world. In a way, that's how we've already characterized that third sense of the word phenomenology. So hopefully this sounds a little familiar to you, because we just kind of said this a few minutes ago. Tries to account for the everyday appearance of the world through how it appears to our consciousness. We've already said that too. So maybe one thing to note right now is that the central construct of pure phenomenology is consciousness. So there's always a big emphasis on consciousness and appearances to consciousness and acts of consciousness. It looks for the essences. That's a loaded word. That's why I'm slowing down on it. And I glossed it. That is to say, the necessary and invariant structures of consciousness. So it's looking for the essences of consciousness. In other words, like let's talk about maybe not perceptual consciousness. Let's talk about dream consciousness. Okay, so from a pure phenomenological point of view, one obvious question would be, what makes dream consciousness dream consciousness? In other words, what is the essence of dream consciousness? And when I say necessary and invariant structures, necessary means it's got to be there for it to qualify as dream consciousness. If it didn't have that quality, that experiential quality, it wouldn't qualify as dream consciousness. And invariant means that it doesn't change or go away or something like that. All right, so what would be the essence of dream consciousness? What makes a dream a dream? And if you think about it, you can sort of apply that to, oh, I don't know, even the process of watching this video. How do you know that you're not dreaming of watching this video right now? Well, the only way that you'd be able to sort of know that with any reliability would be is if you had some kind of idea of what makes a dream and what makes normal reality consciousness, such that you could draw the distinction between the two and apply that distinction to the process of watching this video. Okay, so at first it seems like such a sort of abstract and esoteric academic question to wonder about what makes a dream in terms of our consciousness, but actually you can apply this kind of stuff pretty easily and pretty immediately in your life. Okay, so let's repeat some of that. It looks for the essences, that is to say the necessary and invariant structures of consciousness, which are given in phenomenological reflection. Okay, so that word reflection, it's like you're reflecting upon your experience, right? You're reflecting upon it, you're thinking about it, you're ruminating on it, you're meditating on it, you are contemplating it. And yes, I am a walking thesaurus, or so my wife Nicole tells me. And usually I say the same dumbass dad joke when she says that, and here's the dumbass dad joke. A thesaurus? I thought those were extinct. And then she says, yeah, that never gets old. Okay, learning a little bit too much about me, possibly. All right, so the necessary and invariant structures of consciousness, which are given in phenomenological reflection, I'm emphasizing that word reflection. That's a big deal with respect to phenomenology, with a quality of being beyond doubt. It's like, if you're doing pure phenomenology, what you're looking for is what they call a moment of intuition, all right? Where you have a kind of a realization that you sort of got an aha moment. You're reflecting about, you're wondering about the question, yeah, what makes a dream a dream? Does it have to have this? Does it have to have that? What if it didn't have this? And so on and so forth, to try to find out the essence. And what they're looking for is a kind of aha moment of intuition, where you sort of grasp the essence in a way that feels like, hey, I sort of got the answer here, all right? So that's the kind of moment you're looking for in pure phenomenology. And then I gave you, as it were, the battle cry, the Husserlian battle cry. Husserlian means like Edmund Husserl. All right, it's just the adjectival form of his name. Okay, so, and here's the battle cry. Well, the way it's always translated is this: back to the things themselves. But I think that for the purposes of your learning, a better variation on that would be something like back to the things as we experience them themselves. Okay? Because the problem with just saying back to the things themselves is it can easily sort of trigger you into thinking, oh, this is just about reality the way I normally conceive of it, which is not from the point of view of your consciousness and your subjectivity. Okay, so if I add that extra phrase, I think it sort of helps you out. Back to the things of experience, or back to the things as we actually experience them themselves. Okay, so back to the things themselves is the usual way it's translated, however. Okay, so let's get on to the next one, existential phenomenology. And maybe I'll start this one off by saying, as far as humanistic psychology goes, probably existential phenomenology had the biggest influence on early humanistic psychology. And as we get into it, you'll probably start to see how that's true. But so this one is probably the most important of the three modes. The second most important one would probably be the literary existentialism, and then pure phenomenology coming in bronze medal, I guess. Okay, so existential phenomenology tries to interpret. Okay, so what's implied here is there's not going to be this business of intuiting essences as we saw in the case of pure phenomenology. Instead, this is going to be an interpretive type activity. In a way, it's less ambitious. You're not looking for the essence that's given with this quality of being beyond doubt. Instead, you're just trying to do a sort of rendering or an interpretation of our everyday experience or everyday life or everyday existence before, everyday experience means before you start reflecting and getting curious and trying to figure out what it means as such, right? So most of the time, 99% of the time, even if you're into this stuff, not probably 99% of the time, you're just going through your life, right? You're having your day. And you're making a video, or you're watching a video, or maybe you're watching this like anticipating a test or something like that. Okay, so it's going to be interpreting our everyday lives, everyday experience, everyday existence to get at an articulation of its meaning. Okay, so it's going to be trying to interpret and reflect upon our everyday experience to try to illuminate some element of its significance or structure or meaning. Right? So there's that emphasis on being or existence. There's no essence that's beyond doubt. I've already said that. Rather, the ongoing and open-ended interpretation of experience with respect to the riddle of existence. And the riddle of existence just is, what is existence about? Okay? Like, what are its basic structures? Like, what goes into it? What goes into us, in other words? Okay, so I also made note of a couple recurrent features. So it sees existence in terms of a holistic being in the world. So like we noted earlier, a few minutes ago, when I said this guy you've heard about, Martin Heidegger, who thinks about being in terms of being in the world, that is to say Dasein, right? So you could hopefully anticipate this moment in the video. So it sees existence in terms of a holistic being in the world, and that's where that language crops up, is in existential phenomenology. Okay, so it relies on, oh my goodness, there's a big fancy vocabulary word for you. You pull this one out, next time you're hanging out in the bar, you might get laid. What the hell? So it relies on hermeneutics. Okay, so this is not a word that you can just sort of break down and sort of obviously understand what it's trying to say. So hermeneutics is the sector of philosophy that deals with the nature of interpretation. Okay, so what is it to interpret something? And we've already said that existential phenomenology is going to be interpreting, in a certain way, our everyday experience to try to illuminate its meaning with respect to the question of existence. Okay, we've already said that. So now we're just saying the same thing in a more technical way. Okay, a little bit more vocabulary. So it relies on hermeneutics, this sector of philosophy that deals with the nature of interpretation, and takes being in the world as its nuclear starting point, would be a way of thinking about it. Okay, so this is existential phenomenology. Like I said, and here it is in your notes, probably the greatest influence on early humanistic psychology, okay, is this existential phenomenology jazz. And the place where you can really see it is in this distinction between authenticity and inauthenticity. Another way of glossing that would be authentic existence and inauthentic existence. And the way, and this comes to us once again by way of this guy Martin Heidegger, and his way of thinking about authenticity is in terms of whether you're heading toward your deepest possibilities in life or not. Okay, so if you are, that's what authentic existence is about. If you're fulfilling the deepest possibilities that you possibly can, if you're becoming the deepest and most powerful variation of yourself possible in your life and heading toward that, that's authentic existence. And inauthentic existence is about what we do most of the time, which is just to copy other people and defer to what other people say and defer to social customs and end up basically selling our souls and settling in our lives and living lives of quiet desperation, a la Thoreau, which is hearkening back to something I said 1 or 2 videos ago. Okay, and hopefully you're hearing this distinction we're making now as sounding a whole lot like what we said about self-actualization, because basically they're getting at the same thing. All right? So this business of authenticity that derives from existential phenomenology, finding expression in Maslow's idea of self-actualization, which once again has to do with whether we're at least heading toward and hopefully actualizing the deepest potentialities that are inherent in our being. Okay, so where did Maslow get that idea? Kind of from Heidegger. All right, so, and finally, the third part of that Venn diagram, literary existentialism. Now, when you pick up a book in existential phenomenology, for sure, you know immediately on the first page you're reading hardcore, methodical, philosophical inquiry. There's no mistake about it. When you pick up a book in literary existentialism, a lot of the time it's hard even to tell that you're reading a book that has some kind of philosophical content in it, because a lot of the time they're telling stories. So they start telling this story and, 30 pages later, you're wondering when they're going to get around to the philosophy. Okay, so this is how literary existentialism often operates. Okay, so tends toward a less technically philosophical, more literary or artistic interpretation of existence. So what's the point of literary existentialism? Well, in a way, it's the same point as existential phenomenology. It's just sort of taking a different road to get there, a more artistic type road to get there. So it's about illuminating the nature of human existence and illuminating the nature of our lives for the value of understanding ourselves better, but also for the value of possibly changing how we're alive. Okay, so hopefully this is reminding you a little bit of that interplay between those two layers of meaning, the phenomenal layer of meaning and the phenomenological layer of meaning. Remember what I said about that part of the whole point of doing that kind of hermeneutic activity, that kind of circular activity that oscillates between those two layers, is to change life. Right? So when we interpret life, the whole point of interpreting life is hopefully to change our experience of what life feels like, to make it deeper, more interesting, more powerful, more amplified, and so on. So literary existentialism, yes, it's trying to illuminate the nature of existence, but it's also trying to change the way that we experience our existence by underscoring its basic themes in a artistically evocative way, a literarily evocative way, okay? And provocative way, I would say. And I would say that, boy, these literary existentialists are pretty damn good at doing that, at least from my point of view, they are. And I love them. I just like sort of bust out and say it. Like, I love some of these guys that write in that way. And oh yeah, hell yeah. Okay, so where are we now? We're at the end of the getting started material. Okay, so in the next video in this series for the class, we're going to be looking at Carl Rogers, your first official humanistic psychological book on becoming a person, his most famous work. But for now, that's the end of this video. I hope you have a great, wonderful day. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.